Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to commend Senator Shaheen for a typically thoughtful and compelling speech concerning the proposed nomination of Mr. Hegseth to be Secretary of Defense. I will follow by rising to express my opposition to Mr. Pete Hegseth's nomination to be Secretary of Defense. Mr. Hegseth is the 9th Defense Secretary nominee that I have considered as a member of the Armed Services Committee. I have voted in favor of all of his predecessors, including those in the first Trump administration. While some former secretaries and I have disagreed politically, there was always an understanding that partisanship has no place when it comes to providing for our men and women in uniform. Indeed, the weight of this position, Secretary of Defense, is enormous. The Secretary is responsible for leading a department of 3.5 million service members and civilians, an annual budget of nearly $900 billion, and hundreds of thousands of aircraft, ships, submarines, combat vehicles, satellites, and our nuclear arsenal. They also play a powerful role with allies, partners, and adversaries abroad, having to meet, communicate, and coordinate with a whole range of individuals from many different ethnic groups, many different religious groups. That's part of the role of Secretary of Defense. At a bare minimum, former Secretaries of Defense have had the experience, wisdom, and character to do that job. Mr. Hegseth, however, is simply not qualified to meet the overwhelming demands to be Secretary of Defense. Last week, the Armed Services Committee held a nomination hearing for Mr. Hegseth. During the hearing, my colleagues and I raised a number of concerning reports about him. A variety of sources, including his own writings, implicate him with disregarding the laws of war, financial mismanagement, racist and sexist remarks about men and women in uniform, alcohol abuse, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and other troubling issues. Instead of addressing these reports, many of which are documented and on the record, he dodged and deferred. He did not attempt to alleviate the fears that my colleagues and I have that there is material and a pattern of abuse in his personal history that could be used by adversaries to try to influence him, to try to deflect him from his sworn obligations and duties to the United States, and frankly, to embarrass him as Secretary of Defense. These reports are unlike anything we have seen for a nominee of this importance, and if they are confirmed, they would undermine his ability to be an effective leader. As I have said for months, it is critical that the FBI and the Trump transition team carry out an exhaustive background investigation on Mr. Hegseth. In that regard, I must say that I am extremely disappointed by the investigation process. Before Mr. Hegseth's hearing, I was briefed by a transition team on the findings of the background check. I was alarmed that investigators had neglected to contact critical witnesses and whistleblowers, and I urged them to reopen the investigation. During my experience on the Armed Services Committee, it is unprecedented that the FBI has returned to my office 2 more times, as recently as last night, to provide additional information on the nominee. Frankly, I still do not believe the background investigation is complete. Last week, after the hearing, I was made aware that an individual with disturbing information about Mr. Hegseth has been interviewed by the FBI in December as part of the background investigation. However, their testimony was not adequately included in the briefing provided by the Trump transition team. As such, I asked this individual to recount to me directly the testimony that she had provided to the FBI. I was disturbed by what I received. Earlier this week, the Armed Services Committee received a sworn affidavit from Pete Hegseth's former sister-in-law that alleges specific incidents of Mr. Hegseth's alcohol abuse, threatening and abusive behavior toward his second wife, and a repeated pattern of offensive public misconduct. The affidavit was signed and sworn under penalty of perjury, and it has been made available to all senators to review, and I hope that you do. I will share a few examples from her sworn testimony, which she gave to FBI investigators. Once, while drunk in uniform, which is a violation of military law, Mr. Hegseth was so inebriated that his brother had to carry him out of a Minneapolis strip club. This occurred during a drill weekend with the Minnesota National Guard. The FBI was also told that Mr. Hegseth's second wife had an escape plan that involved texting a safe word to her friends and family to urgently request help without putting herself in more danger. This escape plan was executed on at least one occasion. On at least one occasion, his second wife hid in her closet out of fear. And in many detailed examples, the FBI was told that Mr. Hegseth regularly became so drunk that he passed out, vomited, and had to be carried out of family events and public settings, sometimes shouting sexually and racist offensive comments. My point is this. We know that Pete Hegseth's former sister-in-law testified to the FBI about his history of abuse, alcoholism, and disgraceful public behavior. However, we know now that her testimony was not adequately included in the Trump transitions team background briefing to the Senate. This begs the question, what else is missing from the FBI report? The Senate is not considering a low-level appointee right now. We are advising and consenting on the nominee for Secretary of Defense, and we cannot risk installing a leader who may have a history that is exploitable by our adversaries. Nor can we risk confirming a Secretary of Defense who has shown that he is incapable of being responsible, accountable, and law-abiding 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as that job requires. In addition to Mr. Hegseth's troubling personal conduct, I also have grave concerns about actions he would take as Secretary of Defense. During his nomination hearing, I asked Mr. Hegseth about disturbing efforts underway within the Department of Defense to intimidate military personnel and their families, and reports that the Trump administration may implement a so-called purge board to screen senior military officers for, quote, unfitness to lead. This raises the chilling possibility that the Trump administration may fire officers who are deemed to have the wrong political views. I believe that the Tuesday firing of the U.S. Coast Guard Commandant Admiral Linda Fagan, who by all objective accounts was an admirable leader, proves that the purge is underway. Unfortunately, Mr. Hegseth would not categorically condemn those efforts during his hearing, and instead talked about meritocracy and restoring accountability within the senior ranks of the military. If the Senate confirms Mr. Hegseth this week, who will be fired at the Department of Defense next week? And I doubt very seriously it will be based upon merit or anything else other than a political agenda. And that would be the beginning of the unraveling of the core element of our military. It is not political. It serves neither party nor person. It protects and defends the Constitution of the United States. And if we lose that, we will have lost something that is, I think, the key to our success, not only as a military force, but as a nation. Despite Mr. Hegseth's comment, the United States military is already one of the finest meritocracies in the world. every member of the military is in their position because of their ability. They are chosen by boards of other senior officers who evaluate their performance, who look closely at what they've done, and render their best professional opinion of the capability of that person to move on and assume a particular job. Every member of the military is in their position because of their ability. When there's always a possibility that you need to count on the person next to you to save your life, there is no other choice but meritocracy and value. There is no other choice that you must or can make other than to pick someone whose focus, whose heart, whose spirit is to protect their fellow soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, spacemen, not to exploit them. To make a judgment about their colleagues, not based on their political affiliations, but on the fact that they are a co-soldier, sailor, airman. And I see a dangerous, dangerous point at which we will divert from this historic and compelling approach and become a political organization. We've seen it happen in other places around the world, where militaries are undermined and subjected by political leaders that have a particular political point of view and passion, and they become essentially not an army, but an extension of the political aspirations of the great leader. We can't see that here in America. Our present service members can and should be confident that with hard work and skill and character, they will be successful in their military careers. That's the key criteria. Indeed, this very meritocracy would prevent a person like Mr. Hegseth from rising higher in the ranks of the military. The totality of his own writings and conduct would disqualify any service member from holding any leadership position in the military, much less being confirmed as a Secretary of Defense. If there was evidence that a serving officer in the military was drunk in uniform in a strip club, if there was evidence that a senior military officer was engaged in sexual relations while married to another woman, having just fostered a child from another woman, I can guarantee you that officer's career would end swiftly, either by resignation or by court-martial. Moreover, our service members, since the birth of this country 249 years ago, have taken an oath to the Constitution. Their mission is to protect the country and all of its citizens and the ideals this country was founded on, which should endure no matter who is president or what political party is in power. Mr. Hegseth's idea of meritocracy, however, seems to be that service members should pledge fealty to a president who will be in power for only 4 years and fit the ideas of a party that only half of this nation supports. There is no faster way to undermine the lethality and morale of our nation's military and the support of the nation's citizens for it than to inject politics into the system. Mr. Hegseth, if confirmed, will not improve our military, but destabilize it and weaken the institution. Further, during his hearing, Mr. Hegseth failed to convince me and many of my colleagues that he is capable of running any organization remotely as complex as the Department of Defense. Mr. Hegseth has been the head of 2 separate veterans organizations. From 2008 through 2010, he led the organization Veterans for Freedom, which had an annual budget of less than $10 million. Each year he was in charge, outlays exceeded revenues, until the organization verged on bankruptcy and had to be merged with another group. From 2011 until 2016, Mr. Hegseth ran the organization Concerned Veterans for America. During each of those 5 years, tax records show that the organization spent more than it raised. If this is how Mr. Hegseth manages organizations with a comparatively small staff and budget, how can anyone have confidence that he will be able to effectively manage an organization with hundreds of multi-million and billion-dollar contracts that literally drive the economy of many parts of this country? If confirmed, Mr. Hegseth would be the leader of millions of men and women of every race, religion, and political belief. He can only be an effective leader of an effective fighting force if he has respect for those he leads and they trust he supports them. Unfortunately, Mr. Hegseth has shown disdain and outright hostility for many he would lead. His writings and speeches make clear his opposition to diversity initiatives. He has said, diversity is not our strength, unity is. On a recent podcast, he said, I'm straight up just saying we should not have women in combat now roles. Mr. Hegseth has also written, the other side, the left, is not our friend. We are not esteemed colleagues, nor mere political opponents. We are foes. Either we win or they win. We agree on nothing else. That is not the spirit to bring to lead the men and women of our military forces. When I joined the Army as a young officer in the 1970s, the U.S. military was rife with racial tension. Women were prohibited from serving in most roles. Gay service members were banned, and we relied on a national draft to fill our ranks. The soldiers I served with were proud to do so, but it was certainly not the nation's most capable military by any standard. We have made great progress since then. Today, the Department of Defense is fully integrated. Every race and religion is accepted. Women serve in all combat roles and leadership positions. Sexual orientation is irrelevant to service, and the all-volunteer force visibly reflects the nation it protects. Our military is more diverse than it has ever been, but more importantly, it is more lethal than it has ever been. This is not a coincidence. This diversity and nonpartisanship is the bedrock of our military power. But Mr. Hegseth seeks to destroy that. One of the strengths of the U.S. military, which has made us respected around the world, is the adherence to the rule of law and clear standards on the battlefield to protect civilians and treat prisoners with humanity. Once again, this nominee for Secretary of Defense, if confirmed, will put that principle in doubt. Mr. Hegseth has championed the pardoning of military members who were turned in by their fellow soldiers and SEALs, as well as military contractors convicted of killing 14 Iraqi civilians without cause. He has advocated for the reinstitution of interrogation methods like waterboarding that have been defined as torture, and has belittled the advice and counsel of the Judge Advocates General while on deployment. In his book, The War on Warriors, he wrote, quote, "Should we follow the Geneva Conventions? If our warriors are forced to follow rules arbitrarily and asked to sacrifice more lives so that international tribunals feel better about themselves, aren't we just better off in winning our wars according to our own rules? How can our military personnel trust each other and the partners and allies we need in this dangerous world trust the United States if such rules and conventions are tossed aside? What a bounty this would give our adversaries. And how would we have the moral authority to criticize the North Vietnamese, for example, who tortured pilots like our colleague John McCain, if our Secretary of Defense is saying waterboarding is perfectly fine. We wouldn't. In fact, I think our pilots would be very much concerned if they felt there are no rules of the game. And if they went down behind enemy lines, they would be just brutalized, tortured, etc. And we don't even have a moral objection to it. Finally, my top priority as a United States Senator has always been national security. And my colleagues, I hope, know this. I do not seek partisan wins on all the political spotlight. I want to do right by men and women in uniform, and I refuse to compromise or cut corners on national security issues. The greatest privilege I have had in my life is to lead soldiers, to understand and respect them, to do my best by example and leadership so that they would have confidence that their best interest was my sole interest. That's not what I heard from Mr. Hegseth, and that's not what he's going to bring to the Department of Defense. The process is important for a nomination of this sort. Other than me, Mr. Hegseth refused to meet with any of my Democratic colleagues on the committee. An unprecedented act, a signal that he is not trying to be a nonpartisan secretary. He is, in fact, going to be very partisan. Again, injecting politics into the Department of Defense, which is, in my view, fatal. The committee was denied a second round of questioning with Mr. Hegseth, although we needed that time. And I should point out, historically, when Secretary Hagel was here, we had 3 rounds of questioning. When Secretary Carter was here, we had 2 rounds of questioning. So the precedent was strongly in favor of an additional round. So we've essentially been denied the kind of access that would have revealed more of Mr. Hegseth's qualities, conduct, and thoughts. And that's not appropriate. And as I said previously, the FBI background check was inadequate. Again, the first time I've ever had a background check supplemented by 2 additional addendums to the background check. That's not the way I've experienced business. So I would hope my colleagues are a bit alarmed, that are asking themselves, does this individual have the character and the competence and the composure to be Secretary of Defense? I frankly am not convinced, and stunned in many respects, the lack of scrutiny which too many of my colleagues are using to consider this nomination. The lives of thousands and thousands of men and women in uniform, the security of our nation, and indeed the world is at stake. I hope we will all take time to reflect on whether we are ready to confirm Mr. Hegseth to be Secretary of Defense. I will personally urge my colleagues to vote against the nominee. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.